for this latest in our cross-urban IFL seminar series. Topic this month is biogeochemistry work. And we're lucky enough to have Ben Sulman here from Oak Ridge National Lab and the Southeast Texas Urban IFL to present some of the work that's going on there. So without any further delay from me, Ben, I'll hand it over to you. It looks like you might want to flip the monitors.
Swap.
Yeah, there you go.
Better.
That's great.
Let me see if I can turn my microphone on. Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay. I wasn't sure if my microphone was on or not. Okay, so thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak about what we're doing on the Southeast Texas Urban IFL. I am speaking on behalf of myself and Matthew Hoke from Lamar University. We're kind of jointly leading the wetlands and biogeochemistry part of this project. And I want to thank also the whole Southeast Texas Urban IFL team. It's been a great group of people to work with. So our work on this project, as far as biogeochemistry, is focusing on the role of wetlands as part of the sort of larger urban green infrastructure and sort of urban natural interface. The focus area of SETx is Southeast Texas. So there's this little on the logo, we have a little star in Southeast Texas, and zooming in from there, we're primarily based in the Beaumont area, which is east of Houston along the Gulf Coast. And this is a very sort of flat coastal plain type of region. There's a lot of wetland area around here. So on this map of land cover, the purple areas are all salt marsh and the orange areas are freshwater marsh. So there's a lot of marshland. There's also a lot of the green areas are sort of floodplain, forest, and swamp type of areas. So it's a really important part of that landscape. So backing up a step to talk why we're focusing on wetlands in general, particularly coastal wetlands from a carbon cycle perspective, store a lot of carbon. Really, they can accumulate carbon very rapidly in their sediments, and in terms of burial rate in soils, coastal wetlands have some of the highest carbon burial rates of terrestrial and wetland ecosystems. They also provide a range of other important ecosystem services. So one particularly important issue for the Southeast Texas project is flooding. It's a vulnerability that's pretty important in this area, and coastal wetlands mitigate coastal flooding, especially hurricane related storm surges, and also wetland areas can mitigate river and pluvial flooding. So there's a flood mitigation aspect. They also provide a lot of services related to recreation, habitat for endangered species, and also common species. They support fisheries, which are an important part of the economy and sort of lifestyle in coastal Texas. And healthy wetlands also promote water quality, which is an important consideration. We can assign dollar amounts to many of these ecosystem services that are provided by wetlands. Coastal protection tends to be a really important one, particularly in these Gulf Coast areas where hurricane impacts can be really severe. Especially Southeast Texas was hit by Hurricane Harvey, which caused a lot of damage. So here's some estimates of sort of the monetary value of some of these wetlands. And around Jefferson County, where Beaumont is located, if you add it up over a 30-year period, we can estimate on the order of $1 billion worth of the value of coastal protection from this area of wetlands. So they provide these valuable services. At the same time, a lot of these wetlands, particularly in coastal areas, are vulnerable, and in a lot of areas, including the Beaumont area, they are in decline. So here's one example from some of the field sites that Matthew Hoke is working at. we can see some of these salt marsh areas are healthy. They're doing pretty well. The plants are productive and stable. There are also areas where a combination of changing water management, saltwater intrusion, sea level rise is leading to dieback. So these the marsh grasses are less healthy in some areas. They're dying off and being replaced with open water as the actual sediments and land material under them collapse. And so there's this kind of ongoing marsh collapse, which degrades all of the services that these ecosystems are providing. And moving further upriver, there's also a lot of these floodplain forest areas which mitigate river flooding and also provide important ecosystem services. And a lot of these upstream areas are especially vulnerable to saltwater intrusion, which increases with both storm impacts and sea level rise, and also is exacerbated by drought that reduces river flows. If we zoom back out, Texas has lost a lot of its coastal wetlands over the past several decades. There's kind of ongoing wetland loss across a lot of the Gulf Coast, which affects the vulnerability of a lot of urban areas to storm impacts, among other things. And in particular, some of these wetland losses are due to sort of conversion to other human uses like agriculture and developed areas, but quite a bit of the wetland loss is conversion into open water, which is connected to some of this sort of degradation and sea level rise that's ongoing. So in terms of getting into the actual Southeast Texas project, we are studying wetlands as part of the um, broader regional water management and sort of green infrastructure framework. And so this includes some of these less directly managed ecosystems that I mentioned, so coastal marshes and river floodplains, but also some more directly managed kind of green infrastructure areas. So the Halbuti pump station is connected to this very large detention pond area, which stretches out quite a bit sort of off of this photo. And when there's a risk of major flooding, they can redirect water from this canal and fill up a large volume in this area, which includes a lot of green space, and then drain it back out once the river level goes down. These soccer fields also can be flooded as a flood mitigation strategy. And so we have a mix of sort of heavily managed and less heavily managed green spaces that all contribute to hydrological management around this broader urban area. Looking at Jefferson County, so our urban area of interest is centered around Beaumont and Port Arthur and these other surrounding communities. And there's several different sort of wetland management activities going on. So a lot of these have to do with changing the hydrological management of the area, reconstructing some areas that have been lost, and yeah, a decent number of coastal activities where our project has mostly been focused for the urban IFL is around this Salt Bayou area where there's a couple of important restoration activities going on. So this Salt Bayou area, um, it's a lot of it is managed by Texas Parks and Wildlife as part of a wildlife management area. And so there's been some specific hydrological management changes going on to try to reduce the degradation of this area. So there's been some hydrological changes to reduce saltwater intrusion and increase freshwater inflow to sort of counteract some of the historical canal development and water redirection related to there's some pretty large shipping channels around here that change a lot of the sort of regional water flow in a way that cut off freshwater inputs and led to salinization of these marshes that has led to some collapse of areas that you can kind of see some of the open water areas on this photo of this marsh. And so there's been some projects to mitigate that going on for the past couple of decades. Among the restoration strategies is what's called beneficial use of dredge material. So I mentioned that there's this large shipping channel, and so there's some very active ports around Beaumont. There's a lot of very large ships that go up and down this channel, and they're actually working on developing a major natural gas export terminal as well. And so as part of that, there's a lot of dredging of the river going on. And so when the Army Corps of Engineers dredges out material from the bottom of the river, they have a mandate for using that material for beneficial uses. And one of the beneficial uses is essentially spraying all of this sediment that was taken out of the bottom of the river onto the tops of these marshes to try to increase their elevation and mitigate the loss of marsh elevation that happens as part of the degradation process. So typically, I think you see a photo of sort of spraying a bunch of dark material onto an ecosystem and it looks like it's polluting it. But in this case, it's a strategy for trying to make this marsh healthier. So the idea is to restore some of the sediment deposition that's been lost, increase the elevation so the vegetation can sort of escape sea level rise and flooding, and this can increase vegetation biomass and production. And one of the hypotheses of the observational work on this project is to test whether it's also having an effect on methane flux from these ecosystems. So on the observational side, Matt Hoch's team has been collecting data from several different observational sites around this marsh area. There's some healthy sites that where the marsh has just historically been doing well. There's some degraded or dieback sites in the blue pins where the marsh has been in sort of an ongoing collapse type of state. And then there's some restored areas where this dredge material has been deposited. And so looking at the elevation of these different sites, there's a pretty clear impact of the healthy sites are well above sea level. The degraded sites have lost 20 to 30 centimeters of elevation, which contributes to the degradation of their vegetation, productivity, and the associated sort of health of the marsh. And then the restored sites have regained quite a bit of elevation. This translates into some biogeochemical differences. So at each of these sites, Matt's team has been measuring methane, so surface methane emissions, methane concentrations in the methane concentrations in the subsurface, water table, and then also properties of the sediment, physical properties of the sediment, and pore water biogeochemistry. So important factors like pH, salinity, iron concentrations, sulfate and sulfide concentrations, and dissolved nitrogen concentrations. And in coastal systems like this, the interaction between iron, sulfur, and methane cycling is a really important biogeochemical process. So for example, sulfate is introduced by seawater, tends to be reduced to sulfide under anoxic conditions, and sulfide can be toxic to plants. So that's one contributor to some of the marsh dieback that we're seeing. So taking a quick look across all of these biogeochemical measurements, there's a pretty clear difference across a lot of different factors between the dieback compared to the healthy and restored marshes. The dieback areas tend to have much less iron compared to the healthy and the restored marshes. The salinity is actually not quite as variable as you might expect. So salinity is maybe not as much of a driver as some of the other things. sulfur cycling is quite different. So sulfide is really high in the degraded marshes. And as I mentioned, sulfide is toxic to plants, so that contributes to some of the land loss of like vegetated area that's going on there. And there's probably an interaction between iron and sulfur going on in the restored marshes. So the iron content in these sediments that are being applied to these restorations is pretty high, and iron actually interacts with sulfide to bind it into iron sulfides, which could be contributing to the lower sulfide levels in the restored marshes, which help to mitigate the loss of vegetation. Looking at methane, um, the soil methane inventory is, so the amount of methane in the sediments is pretty connected to um, both elevation and the sort of healthy versus dying back state of the marsh. So the dying back areas tend to have lower elevation, and the lower elevation areas have much higher methane concentrations in the subsurface. And that's correlated with surface methane emissions. So there's the highest methane emissions are in the dieback areas, and that's being mitigated by restoration. So these are individual sort of point measurements at specific points in space and time. And we've been fortunate to have some supplementary funding that we got from DOE last year to targeting understanding the health of these areas after potential storm events. And so with this DOE funding and also through the Ameriflux Management Project's Rapid Response Program, we've installed a flux tower out on this marsh to try to get more continuous measurements of what's going on with the process of this marsh's degradation over time and how it responds to variations in weather. So the flux tower is located around here, sort of between some of the restored areas and some of the degrading areas. The flux tower we have set up has CO2 and methane flux analyzers along with kind of a standard meteorological system. And we're also in the process of installing a sonde that is going to go sort of next to the tower that will also give us continuous water level and salinity, among other things. I just want to sort of remind people, sort of like, depending on the angle, it looks like this, from this angle, it looks like a nice pristine marsh, but there's also a lot of activity going on here. There's some active oil derricks sort of across the channel from here, which we're not sure if it's probably not close enough to really pick up much of it with this flux tower, but depending on the wind direction, we might be able to pick up some methane plumes coming off of this oil activity. There's also some pretty large installations of petrochemical plants sort of off to the edge of this marsh, and also there's a lot of construction activity going on sort of on the river related to this port construction, natural gas port construction. And so we just got this tower installed in July, and we're kind of beginning to have a chance to look at the data. So I'm not going to get too far into it, but we do have sort of 6 weeks of data at this point that we're starting to look at, and we've got kind of your typical time series of photosynthetically active radiation, air temperature. It's pretty hot during the day in summer in South Texas, as you might imagine. And it seems like a pretty productive marsh ecosystem just based on sort of spot checking the daily CO2 fluxes. And methane flux is pretty low from a first look. So I'm gonna move on into the modeling side of our activity. So we're interested in integrating this data that's being collected into land surface models and biogeochemical models that we can use to scale some of these insights up to more regional scales across this area, which includes this highly urbanized area around Beaumont and Port Arthur, but also these large areas of wetlands, both on the coast and also some river or like forested wetlands further inland, which all kind of combine into the regional um, green and gray infrastructure of this area. So looking at wetland processes specifically, one thing we're working on within the E3SM land model, which is the main tool that we're using, is defining the responses of wetland vegetation to saltwater intrusion and changes in sea level. So we've implemented salinity responses for key different types of wetland plants. So these include salt marsh plants in green, which are relatively salt tolerant compared to freshwater marsh plants um, in blue, which are less salt tolerant. So we can try to simulate the impact of saltwater intrusion events. Some of this freshwater forest vegetation also is very salt intolerant. And so we're setting up simulations that include those contrasts. We can show from some previous work that including the salinity and flooding responses of vegetation in ELM does help us to do a better job with simulating productivity of marshes and other wetland ecosystems that are subject to saltwater intrusion. And in the context of marsh dieback specifically, that allows us to simulate this sort of divergence over time between a healthy marsh where elevation is consistently above sea level versus a dying back marsh where the relative sea level is increasing with respect to the height of the marsh, and it's causing the vegetation to die off over time. We're also doing some biogeochemical simulations. So I mentioned these interactions between iron and sulfur cycling and methane production that occur in marshes, and we've coupled that into our E3SM land model simulation so we can simulate these redox interactions in the subsurface through a coupling with a reactive transport model. So just quickly going through how this works in practice. So I'm comparing a saline versus a freshwater marsh simulation in this model. And so the saline water introduces sulfate, which can be reduced to sulfide, which uses up some of the dissolved organic carbon. So it leads to lower DOC concentrations, increased dissolved inorganic carbon in pore water. And this has a really strong effect on methane production. And so we can simulate the big contrast between higher methane production from freshwater marshes compared to much lower methane production from saltwater affected like salt marshes. So this is an example from one site. And if we zoom back out, so looking at this whole area of Texas, sort of from Beaumont, Port Arthur, and going west, we can use the National Wetland Inventory and the National Land Cover Database to map out land cover. And we have some salt marsh and freshwater marsh areas and forested swamp areas. And running this model over those contrasting ecosystem types, we can simulate the contrast in methane production per unit area across these different parts of that coastal landscape. And this gives us an ability to talk about some of the environmental co-benefits of preserving some of these ecosystems, which in addition to providing flood mitigation services, also can provide greenhouse gas like net flux services. So getting back to how this interacts with this sort of urban regional aspects of this project, as you recall, we have these more directly managed and less directly managed green infrastructure areas that exist as part of the broader landscape. And by integrating those into models that we can run at large scales, we can provide more information about what's the function of these green areas within the broader landscape and ideally provide information that's helpful for communities and planners to have the information they need to prioritize the role of these different green infrastructure approaches as part of a broader regional land use. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge support from U.S. Department of Energy Office of Science. I'm from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and a lot of the local team is from Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. And we've had a lot of help from Matt Hoke's crew, which has done a lot of the field work, and also Jeff Schwanner and Bailey Murphy and Fong Lee from Oak Ridge National Lab, who all of us were out in July in South Texas in the sun when it was like 88 degrees out and 100% humidity. So thanks a lot to them also for contributing to this. And I'll be happy to take some questions if we have time.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. Really fascinating work going on down there. Um, Let me do a quick check. I still don't see Kevin here. Kevin, are you here under a different name? Okay. Well, I hope Kevin's okay. We were emailing about this recently, so I know he was aware. So hopefully nothing too bad has come up for him. Ben, what that means is there's time for questions.
All right.
So we can open it right up if anyone wants to get us started.
Hey, this is Leave. I noticed on one graph, and I'm not sure if you showed it because I came in late, but that the CO2 concentrations were much higher than expected. Can you explain that, or did I see a wrong graph?
Um, let me, I'll see if I can find the graph that you're thinking about. Um, was it this, was it this graph or was it earlier than this?
So as I said, I came in late because I had a student meeting, but I think you and Matt showed the CO2 concentrations in the air.
CO2 concentration.
Did you have it showing this time? There's CO2.
So this is CO2 flux.
Yeah, but the concentrations were a lot higher on one graph, but it may have been something that wasn't corrected yet. Do you have any information on what the CO2? I mean, they were like what I would expect in a somebody going to the gym or in a crowded classroom.
I think I remember what you're talking about. So when we were looking at the like CO2 analyzer data from the Flux Tower originally, I think we had to do some corrections on the units of it basically, and I think this the actual CO2 concentrations that we have I think are a lot more reasonable than the first time that we looked at them. I think we had to update some like metadata coming out of the analyzer, but I think we resolved that.
All right, that's great. Thanks for because otherwise I couldn't figure out why the marsh was producing so much CO2. But no, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and I feel like the CO2 fluxes that we have at this point look pretty reasonable. The methane concentrations have been pretty spiky, and I think we haven't really had time to get into too much detail of how much of that is sort of instrument noise versus how much I think we were always kind of interested in trying to see if we could attribute some of the observed atmospheric methane to stuff coming off some of the like oil derricks in the area and some of the other kind of industrial activity in the area that could be producing plumes of really high methane concentrations. I think it would be interesting if we could pick that up, but we haven't had time to really do a lot of analysis of it yet.
Thanks.
So then maybe I'll just jump in on exactly what you just said, because that was in the back of my mind as well as you were presenting. So is the sense that the natural fluxes, because of where you are just you're not getting any signal from industrial activity at all, or that like that is there any thought of whether that will be picked up in any sense in these experiments?
I wouldn't be surprised if like if the wind's blowing from the right direction, if we could pick up some of what's coming off those oil derricks because they're not that far away. But I think we need to have a chance to really do some like kind of footprint analysis and like start subdividing things by wind direction before we can really tell for sure. I do think it's going to be really interesting because it's this pretty heterogeneous landscape, and some of the like chamber fluxes that Matt's team did earlier showed that there's a lot of variability in methane flux coming off of different parts of this landscape. So like the healthy marsh is not producing that much methane because I think it has kind of higher salinity levels. There's maybe more oxygen going into the subsurface. I think some of the open water areas, including some of the like canals and stuff, might be producing a lot more methane. And then we are not that far from some of these, yeah, like industrial areas. And there's some really, really huge petrochemical facilities out there.
Hmm. Got it. Thank you. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, very interesting talk. Drainage management is really important out here between canals, ditches, pumping, and so forth. Are you trying to build in any of that to the groundwater hydrology?
So we're part of the SETx team is we're the wetland work that I talked about is kind of embedded within this larger water effort. And so Bagia Rathore, who's also at ORNL, has been working with hydrological modeling specifically to integrate some of the active water management into the advanced terrestrial simulator, which is the hydrological model that we're using a lot of. So he's including some of these pumping stations and kind of that like active water infrastructure in those simulations. So yeah, that's really a goal of the project is to be able to do a better job of modeling that sort of active engineered water management as part of the regional system, along with some of these like green infrastructure approaches.
Okay. Oh,
I
Chris,
have
you
a
just came
que-
on. You could say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering about the gradient from sort of the Houston area all the way down to the coastline. And is there enough information to try and see gradients that would be, acceptable in terms of what's happening there?
So can you say a little more about what kind of gradient you're thinking about?
What's happening in the center of the Houston versus what's happening out at the Outer Banks, I guess.
Do you mean what's happening in terms of
In
what?
terms of the fluxes of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, anything that's coming out of the soil. The ditches, are there things that are more, are there issues with the ditches themselves where it's more concentrated? Or are we talking about the rivers, which are probably less concentrated, I would expect? So are those types of things being found with the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the measurements that we actually have as part of this project are not sort of broadly distributed enough to really capture that gradient all the way to Houston. We do have some water quality measurements going kind of up the Neches River around Beaumont, and so that I think we do have the ability to capture some of the gradients of water quality, kind of like going up around the Beaumont area. I think it would be really interesting to measure some of these greenhouse gas fluxes across a broader range of different, like especially getting into some of these detention pond type areas that are kind of intermittently flooded. And I think we haven't really had the resources to do a really like broadly distributed sampling campaign across that many areas. We've kind of more concentrated on the like the salt marsh area that I showed you, and then there's some measurements also going on kind of up the river, but I think we just haven't been able to collect measurements across too many more of the like different green infrastructure areas within the project. But I think it would be really interesting to get that data if we have a chance.
So Chris, this is Lee from Lamar. So
Yep.
between the area that we're studying, which is the Beaumont Port Arthur area of Texas, and Houston, is a huge portion of the Chenier Plain, basically the entire county of Chambers and half of Jefferson County is the Anahuac wildlife area, huge portions of the Chenier Plain and stuff like that, hardly populated at all, nothing but alligators and salt grass with cows and swamps and stuff like that. So it's hard to do a gradient when there's that big of a buffer in between the two areas. Most people study the Houston area separately from this area because of the difference. And Houston area too has a lot of petrochemical stuff and obviously has a lot of bayous, but it also is heavily populated, whereas this area is not nearly as heavily populated with people, but even more populated with petrochemical facilities and alligators and ducks and birds and other things which you wouldn't expect would be the main populations. You have the extreme natural environment, it's part of the migration, the great migration thing for the birders and duck hunting and all the other stuff. And the Big Thicket National Preserve and all that, with the most intense petrochemical at the same time. So they're diversely different areas. We're more like Southwest Louisiana, which again is industry and not that much population and a lot of swamp.
I guess I'm thinking now about Baltimore. Is there anything that would be having those densities of those part of the gas in that area would be just comparable at all in terms of what we're seeing down in that area?
Aren't you surrounded by some swamps just south of you in Baltimore?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? I mean, in BSEC, we haven't focused on that, but I think maybe some of the folks who've been more involved in the Northeast Corridor work and some other work around the Chesapeake could comment on that. All right. Well, with that, maybe I'll thank Ben again. Really interesting work. Can't wait to see the continued evolution of it. And thanks for the discussion as well, everybody. We'll catch up with Southwest IFL at a later date. I apologize that we weren't able to get both talks in today, but that gave us time for this conversation. So see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks a lot.